Las Vegas, August 12, 1976. The desert air still held the heat of another relentless summer day, but inside the International Hotel, the atmosphere felt nothing short of electric. More than 15,000 people had filled every seat hours before showtime. Couples dressed in their finest evening clothes leaned over the velvet balconies. Veterans proudly wore medals across their jackets. Mothers clutched homemade Elvis scrapbooks against their chests. Teenagers who had traveled across several states screamed every time the stage lights flickered. Everyone had come for the same reason: to witness the greatest entertainer on earth. Backstage, however, silence. A narrow hallway stretched toward the glowing stage entrance. The walls vibrated beneath the thunder of thousands of impatient voices. "Elvis! Elvis! Elvis!" Each chant grew louder than the last. Yet the man they were calling for wasn't smiling. Elvis Presley stood alone in front of a mirror, adjusting the jeweled collar of his famous white jumpsuit. Under the bright dressing room lights, the rhinestones sparkled like tiny stars. But his eyes looked tired. Not physically, emotionally. Charlie Hodge quietly entered the room, carrying Elvis's guitar. "You ready?" Elvis looked at himself for another long second. "You ever wonder?" Charlie stopped. "Wonder what?" Elvis smiled faintly. "If all these people are really here to see me, or the man they remember." Charlie laughed softly. "They're here because nobody makes people feel like you do." Elvis looked down at his hands. Hands that had signed millions of autographs, hands that had shaken presidents, hands that had held microphones in front of crowds larger than entire cities. Yet tonight, for reasons he couldn't explain, his heart felt unusually heavy. He couldn't have known that before the night was over, someone in that audience would change his life forever. The house lights suddenly dimmed, the arena exploded. The opening notes of Also sprach Zarathustra echoed through the massive hall. Every person leaped to their feet. Security guards instinctively covered their ears. Women burst into tears before Elvis had even appeared. The curtains slowly opened. A brilliant golden spotlight cut through the darkness. And there he stood, Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. The crowd erupted with a force so powerful it felt almost physical. Thousands of flashbulbs illuminated the arena like lightning. For nearly 2 full minutes, nobody could hear the music. Nobody could hear the band. All they could hear was pure love. Elvis smiled, the familiar smile the world adored. He lifted one hand. The audience somehow screamed even louder. "Good evening, everybody!" Another explosion of cheers. "My goodness," he chuckled. "I think y'all might wake up the whole city tonight." Laughter rolled through the audience. Within moments, the music began. "C.C. Ryder." His voice filled every corner of the enormous theater. Rich, warm, powerful, exactly as everyone had hoped. One song became another. "I Got a Woman," "Love Me," "Jailhouse Rock," "You Gave Me a Mountain." Each performance seemed stronger than the last. Elvis joked with fans in the front row. He kissed scarves before throwing them into the audience. He laughed with the orchestra. He danced. He pointed at children sitting on their father's shoulders. He made 15,000 strangers feel as though he were singing to each of them alone. This was what legends looked like. But legends were still human. Halfway through the concert, after another thunderous standing ovation, Elvis reached for a towel. He wiped the sweat from his forehead. Then, almost by accident, his eyes wandered toward the third row. He froze. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Hundreds of faces, hundreds of smiles, hundreds of cameras. Then, he saw her. A young woman wearing a simple blue dress. She wasn't waving, she wasn't screaming, she wasn't reaching toward the stage like everyone else. She simply sat there, perfectly still. Tears streamed silently down her face. Not the joyful tears Elvis had seen thousands of times before. These were different. Pain. Real pain. The kind of pain people tried desperately to hide. For reasons even he couldn't explain, Elvis couldn't look away. The band continued playing. The audience kept cheering. Yet everything around him suddenly seemed to disappear. It was as though 15,000 people had faded into darkness, leaving only one young woman beneath a single, invisible spotlight. Something inside Elvis whispered, "Go to her." He tried returning his attention to the music. He couldn't. He glanced back. She was still crying, still completely motionless, almost as if she had forgotten she was sitting inside the loudest concert in America. Elvis lowered his microphone. The band looked confused. One by one, the instruments stopped. The arena slowly fell silent. 15,000 people looked toward the stage. Nobody understood what had happened. Elvis stepped forward. His voice became softer than anyone expected. "Hold on, just a second." The crowd grew even quieter. "I think somebody out there needs a friend tonight." Thousands of heads turned simultaneously. Nobody knew who he meant. Elvis slowly lifted his hand, then pointed directly toward the third row. "You." The young woman looked behind herself. Surely, he couldn't be talking to her. "Yes," Elvis smiled gently. "The beautiful young lady in the blue dress." The spotlight immediately found her. The audience gasped. She covered her face. More tears, even more than before. Elvis spoke with the same kindness a father might use to comfort a frightened child. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Her lips trembled. For several seconds, no sound came out. Finally, barely louder than a whisper, "Jenny." Elvis smiled. "Jenny." He repeated the name as though committing it to memory forever. "That's a beautiful name." He paused, then looked directly into her tear-filled eyes. "Jenny, why are you crying?" Jenny tried to answer, but no words came. Her shoulders trembled as she fought to hold back the grief she had carried for weeks. 15,000 people watched in complete silence, yet she felt as though she and Elvis were the only two people in the room. Elvis slowly stepped to the very edge of the stage. "You don't have to say anything if you don't want to." Jenny wiped her eyes. "No, I came all this way to tell you something." The audience leaned forward. Nobody shouted. Nobody screamed. It was unlike any Elvis concert anyone could remember. Security gently helped Jenny climb onto the stage. As she reached the top step, Elvis immediately offered his hand. She hesitated. He smiled warmly. "It's all right, sweetheart." Jenny placed her shaking hand into his. The applause that followed wasn't loud. It was gentle, respectful. The kind of applause people give when they know they are witnessing something special. Elvis guided her to the center of the stage. Under the bright lights, she looked impossibly small. Her blue dress was simple. Her shoes showed signs of long travel. Her eyes, however, they carried the weight of someone much older than 19. Elvis lowered the microphone. "So, You're from Texas? Jenny nodded. San Antonio. That's a beautiful place. A faint smile appeared across Jenny's face. It is. What brings you all the way to Las Vegas? She looked down. I promised someone I'd come. Elvis noticed the way her voice cracked. You promised who? For several long seconds, Jenny couldn't answer. She reached into her purse. The audience watched every movement. Slowly, she pulled out a tiny red toy car. It was worn. The paint had chipped away. One wheel barely turned anymore. Elvis looked at it with quiet curiosity. Jenny held it tightly. This belonged to my little brother. The arena became perfectly still. My little brother. Her voice broke. Miguel. Elvis gently placed one hand on her shoulder. Tell me about Miguel. Tears rolled freely down Jenny's face. He was only 8. A collective gasp spread through the audience. He loved music. He loved to sing. He wanted to grow up and become just like you. Elvis swallowed hard. Jenny continued. When he got sick, he stopped asking for toys. He stopped asking to go outside. He stopped asking for birthdays. He only asked for one thing. Elvis quietly asked, What was that? Your records. The king lowered his eyes. Jenny smiled through her tears. He knew every word. He would stand in front of the television with a hairbrush. He pretended it was a microphone. He wore my father's belt like it was one of your stage belts. Soft laughter echoed through the arena. Even Elvis smiled. He'd say, Jenny imitated her little brother's tiny voice, Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all very much. The audience laughed gently. Then, Jenny's smile disappeared. When the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do, Miguel wasn't afraid. Elvis felt something tighten inside his chest. He told my mother, Don't cry. Mr. Elvis sings about love. Love means we're never really gone. Jenny looked directly into Elvis's eyes. The last song he ever heard was Love Me Tender. Elvis closed his eyes. The words struck him harder than any applause ever had. Jenny continued speaking. I sat beside his hospital bed. My mother held one hand. My father held the other. I pressed play on your record. The room became quiet. Miguel smiled. He looked at all of us and whispered. Jenny could barely breathe. Tell Elvis, thank you. Silence. Absolute silence. The musicians stood frozen. Charlie Hodge slowly removed his glasses. Several members of the orchestra wiped tears from their faces. Elvis stared at Jenny. He wanted to respond, but he couldn't. His throat refused to let the words come out. Finally, in a whisper almost too quiet for the microphone, What did you say? Jenny repeated it. He said, Tell Elvis. Thank you. Elvis covered his mouth. His shoulders began to shake. For decades, millions had seen Elvis laugh. Millions had watched him dance. Millions had watched him perform. Almost nobody had ever seen him cry. Until now. One tear slipped down his cheek, then another. Within seconds, he completely broke down. The audience watched in stunned silence. The king of rock and roll wasn't crying because of fame. He wasn't crying because of success. He was crying because somewhere, an 8-year-old boy he had never met had carried his songs into the darkest moment of his short life. Charlie quietly walked toward him. Elvis? Elvis raised one hand. No. He took a deep breath. I need a minute. He turned toward the audience. His voice trembled. Ladies and gentlemen, I've sung these songs thousands of times. I've stood on stages all over the world. I've met presidents. I've met kings. I've met movie stars. But tonight, he looked toward Jenny, I met a little hero. Many people in the audience were openly crying now. Some held each other's hands. Others hugged complete strangers. Elvis slowly knelt so he could look Jenny directly in the eyes. I wish I could have met Miguel. Jenny nodded. He would have loved that. Elvis smiled sadly. I think I just did. He looked toward the piano, then back at the band. I wasn't planning to sing this next, but some moments choose the music for us. He gently took Jenny's hand. Would you stay here with me? Jenny nodded through her tears. I'd be honored. Elvis walked slowly toward the grand piano, not as a superstar, not as an icon, simply as a man whose heart had just been changed forever. He sat down before the keys. His fingers rested silently above them. The audience waited without making a sound. Then Elvis whispered into the microphone, "This song is for Miguel." And as his hands slowly touched the piano, the first gentle notes of "Love Me Tender" floated through the silent arena. The first note echoed through the arena so softly that it barely seemed real. It drifted across the silent crowd like a prayer. No screaming, no applause, no cameras flashing, only silence. Elvis rested his fingers on the piano, closed his eyes, and drew one slow breath. For the first time that evening, he wasn't performing for 15,000 people. He was singing for one little boy. One little boy he would never meet. One little boy whose courage had somehow reached across life itself. His voice emerged almost as a whisper. "Love me tender." The words carried an entirely different meaning now. Every syllable sounded heavier, more fragile, as though each lyric was wrapped in grief and hope at the same time. Jenny stood beside the piano, clutching Miguel's tiny red toy car against her heart. She could almost hear her brother singing beside her. She remembered the hospital room, the sterile white walls, the constant beeping of the machines, the smell of medicine. Miguel's tiny fingers wrapped around hers, his smile, so weak, yet somehow stronger than anyone else's. "Jenny," he had whispered, "when I get scared, play Elvis." She had. Every single day, every treatment, every sleepless night, every painful morning, whenever fear entered the room, Elvis's voice chased it away. Now, standing beside the man whose music had comforted her brother, she finally understood why Miguel had smiled until his final breath. Halfway through the song, Elvis looked toward Jenny. He nodded gently. Without saying a word, he invited her to sing. Jenny hesitated. She had never sung before an audience, certainly not before thousands, certainly not beside Elvis Presley. But then she remembered Miguel pretending a hairbrush was a microphone. She smiled through her tears. Very softly, she joined him. "Never let me go." Her voice was quiet, gentle, completely untrained, yet it carried something technique never could. Truth. The arena seemed to stop breathing. Several musicians lowered their heads. Charlie Hodge quietly wiped another tear from his face. Even the security guards standing at the edge of the stage struggled to hide their emotions. As Elvis and Jenny finished the final line together, silence returned. Not because people didn't know how to react, because nobody wanted the moment to end. For nearly 10 long seconds, no one moved. Then, one man stood. He began clapping slowly. Another joined him, then another. Within moments, every person inside the International Hotel was standing. The applause rolled across the arena like thunder. People cried openly. Couples embraced. Parents held their children tighter. Some fans later said it was the only standing ovation they had ever witnessed where almost everyone was crying. Elvis remained seated at the piano. He wasn't looking at the audience. He was looking at Miguel's little toy car. So that's what he carried everywhere? Jenny nodded. He never let it leave his pocket. Elvis gently reached out. May I? Jenny carefully placed the little red car into his hands. He examined every scratch, every faded patch of paint, every tiny imperfection. Then he smiled. You know, my mama always told me, it's never the expensive things that become treasures. It's the things filled with love. Jenny nodded. Miguel would have agreed. Elvis slowly stood. He walked to center stage, holding the toy car high enough for everyone to see. This is worth more than any award I've ever received. The audience applauded again. He turned toward Jenny. I can't bring Miguel back. His voice cracked. I wish with all my heart that I could. But I promise you something. Jenny looked up. I'll never sing this song the same way again. She covered her mouth. I'll think about him. Every single time. Tears streamed freely down her face. Elvis carefully returned the toy car. Then, without warning, he wrapped Jenny in a long embrace. Not for the cameras, not for the audience, simply because another human being needed it. When they stepped apart, Elvis removed one of his famous white scarves. He looked at it for a moment, then gently tied it around Jenny's shoulders. This belongs to you now. Jenny immediately shook her head. I can't. Oh yes, you can. It belongs with someone who understands what music is really for. The audience erupted again, but the surprises weren't over. Elvis walked backstage for a brief moment. The audience exchanged confused glances. Less than a minute later, he returned carrying a beautifully wrapped guitar, the same style of guitar he often gave to young musicians. He walked back to Jenny. This was supposed to be a gift for somebody else. He smiled. I think I found the right owner. Jenny stared in disbelief. For me? No, Elvis smiled warmly. For Miguel. She looked confused. He wanted to become a singer. I think his dream deserves to keep living. I want you to learn. I want you to sing. And every time you do, I want one little boy's story to live through your voice. Jenny could no longer speak. She hugged the guitar as though it contained her brother's heartbeat. The audience applauded for several minutes. Eventually, Jenny began walking toward the stairs. Halfway there, she stopped, turned around, and ran back. She threw her arms around Elvis one final time. Thank you. No, sweetheart, Elvis whispered. Thank you for reminding me why I started singing. The concert continued that night. Elvis sang many more songs. The audience cheered, they laughed, they danced. But something had changed. Every lyric carried more meaning. Every smile looked more genuine. Every note felt like a gift. People who attended that concert would later say they had not simply watched a performance. They had witnessed a man rediscover his purpose. Backstage after the show, nobody spoke for several minutes. The room remained unusually quiet. Charlie finally broke the silence. I've never seen you like that. Elvis sat down slowly. Neither had he. He looked toward the empty stage entrance. "You know what scares me?" Charlie shook his head. "I'm always afraid people only remember the songs." He smiled softly. "But tonight, they remembered the heart behind them." Charlie placed a hand on his shoulder. "No, Elvis. They always did. You just remembered it too." In the months that followed, stories from that unforgettable night spread across America. Parents wrote letters describing how Elvis's music had comforted children battling illness. Hospitals began using music therapy more frequently. Fans shared stories they had kept hidden for years. Many said they had finally found the courage to speak because Elvis had cried without shame. Jenny returned home carrying much more than a guitar. She carried hope. She eventually learned to play the instrument Elvis had given her. She sang "Love Me Tender" every year on Miguel's birthday. Not with sadness alone, but with gratitude. Years later, she helped establish a foundation supporting music programs for seriously ill children, believing that a single song could sometimes offer comfort when medicine could not. Elvis would not live long enough to see everything that followed. But those closest to him later said that something inside him had changed forever after that evening in Las Vegas. He no longer saw his concerts as performances alone. He saw them as opportunities to heal. Decades passed. The lights of the International Hotel changed. The city evolved. New stars filled new stages. But those who had been there on that unforgettable August night never forgot what they witnessed. They did not remember the costumes. They did not remember the ticket prices. They did not remember which songs opened or closed the show. They remembered a whisper, a young sister carrying the memory of her little brother, a toy car held together by love, and a legendary performer who discovered that the greatest gift he could ever give was not fame. It was compassion. Because in the end, the loudest moment of Elvis Presley's career was not the roar of 15,000 fans. It was the silence that followed one heartbreaking sentence. "My little brother wasn't afraid because he had your music." And perhaps that is how legends are truly measured. Not by the records they sell, not by the crowds they gather, but by the lives they quietly touch when the lights grow dim. That night, the king of rock and roll did far more than sing. He reminded an entire arena, and generations afterward, that music, at its very best, is not simply heard, it is felt, it comforts, it heals. And sometimes, it becomes the last light someone carries into the darkness.